The boardroom fell silent as Abigail stood at the head of the marble conference table, her eyes cold as winter steel. Adelaide's champagne glass trembled in her manicured hand. Aaron's confident smirk had vanished completely. Around the table, 12 executives shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, suddenly aware that everything they thought they knew was about to shatter. Abigail's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You thought you could humiliate me on my own airline?" 3 hours earlier, Adelaide had screamed those words that still echoed in Abigail's memory, "Get this black girl out of my first class." Now, the woman who had demanded her removal sat frozen, watching her entire world collapse in real time. Before we dive into what happened next, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. If you believe justice always finds a way, smash that like button right now. Hit subscribe because this story will restore your faith that karma is real. You won't believe what Abigail does next. Now, let's rewind 3 hours and see exactly how we got here. Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport pulsed with the frantic energy of December 23. Thousands of travelers crowded every terminal, dragging oversized luggage decorated with holiday ribbons, clutching boarding passes like golden tickets home for Christmas. The air smelled of cinnamon pretzels and airport coffee, mixed with the sharp scent of stress and anticipation. Gate announcements echoed over crying children and the constant rumble of suitcase wheels across polished floors. Abigail Thompson stood in the serpentine check-in line at Terminal C, her navy blue hoodie pulled up against the cold draft that swept through the automatic doors each time they opened. At 26 years old, she looked like any other young traveler heading home for the holidays. Her worn backpack hung from one shoulder, and she scrolled through her phone with the easy patience of someone who flew frequently. After 2 exhausting weeks in Paris finalizing acquisition deals and meeting with international investors, all she wanted was to collapse into her first-class seat and sleep during the 4-hour flight home to her family in Detroit. The line moved with glacial slowness. Abigail finally reached the counter where a middle-aged white woman with severely pulled-back hair and a tight smile waited. The agent's name tag read, Sandra. Abigail handed over her driver's license and pulled up her mobile boarding pass. Sandra's smile flickered when she saw the first-class designation. Her eyes darted between Abigail's face and the screen, then back again. "This is your ticket?" Sandra asked, her tone shifting from professional to suspicious in an instant. "Yes, seat 2A, Abigail replied calmly, though a familiar knot began forming in her stomach. She had experienced this dance too many times before. "Can I see your credit card? The one you purchased this ticket with?" Sandra's fingers hovered over her keyboard, not yet processing the check-in. Abigail pulled out her black Amex, the weight of it solid in her hand. Sandra examined it with unnecessary scrutiny, turning it over twice, holding it up to the light as if checking for forgeries. Behind Abigail, the line was growing restless. A man in a business suit sighed loudly. A woman with 2 toddlers shifted her weight impatiently. "Is there a problem?" Abigail kept her voice level, professional. Years of navigating corporate boardrooms had taught her that showing emotion only gave people ammunition. "I just need to verify some information. First-class tickets are expensive." Sandra's implication hung in the air like smoke. She picked up her desk phone and called someone, speaking in low tones while glancing repeatedly at Abigail. The whispers started rippling through the line behind her. Abigail could feel eyes boring into her back. "Probably used someone else's credit card," a woman murmured to her companion, not bothering to lower her voice. "Or one of those scam websites," another voice added. A heavy-set man in a red flannel shirt spoke louder, clearly intending for Abigail to hear. "Probably stole the ticket or used welfare money. You know how they are." The words hit like physical blows, but Abigail kept her expression neutral, her shoulders squared. She had learned long ago that reacting only confirmed their prejudices. Better to remain composed, dignified, even as rage simmered beneath her skin. Sandra finally hung up and began typing with exaggerated slowness. She printed the boarding pass but marked something in the system, her screen angled away so Abigail could not see. Gate D42. Boarding begins in 90 minutes. No smile, no, have a nice flight, just a dismissive slide of documents across the counter. As Abigail gathered her things, Sandra called over a security guard. Albert, according to his badge, was a tall white man with a buzz cut and the bearing of former military. "Ma'am, we need to do a random security check," he announced, though his eyes had been on Abigail specifically. "Nothing random about it." The secondary screening happened right there at the check-in desk, in full view of hundreds of travelers. Albert went through her backpack item by item, pulling out her laptop, her toiletries, her neatly folded change of clothes. Other passengers stared openly now, some recording on their phones. Children pointed. Parents pulled their kids closer as if proximity to Abigail posed some danger. She stood with her arms slightly away from her body as a female security officer patted her down with rough, impersonal efficiency. The whole process took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of public humiliation, of being marked as suspicious, as other, as someone who did not belong in first class or perhaps did not belong in the airport at all. When they finally cleared her, Albert said nothing, no apology for the inconvenience, just a curt nod as if she should be grateful they let her proceed at all. Abigail walked toward security screening, her hands shaking slightly as she pulled her backpack onto her shoulders. She passed a family of 4, all white, being waved through with warm smiles from the same agent who had interrogated her. The contrast was not lost on anyone watching. In the bathroom, Abigail locked herself in a stall and took 3 deep breaths, forcing the tears back. She pulled out her phone and took screenshots of her boarding pass, the time stamp, everything. Document it all. That was the first rule she had learned. Without proof, these incidents never happened, at least not officially. Terminal D buzzed with the controlled chaos of holiday travel, but Gate 42 represented a different world. First-class passengers lounged in the priority boarding area, sipping complimentary champagne and checking their Rolex watches. They wore cashmere and confidence in equal measure, their designer luggage lined up like soldiers awaiting orders. The contrast with the main boarding area was stark. Families with crying babies pressed against the regular boarding lanes while these privileged few enjoyed their bubble of comfort. When boarding began, Abigail waited for Zone 1 to be called. She walked down the jet bridge, her hoodie still up, her backpack comfortable against her shoulders. The airplane door loomed ahead, that threshold between worlds. Flight attendants stood just inside, their smiles professional and practiced. Aaron, the head flight attendant, checked boarding passes with brisk efficiency. His blonde hair was styled perfectly, his navy uniform pressed to knife-sharp creases. When Abigail handed him her boarding pass, his smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, but she caught it. That microsecond of surprise, of reassessment, of doubt. "First class is to the left," he said, his tone suggesting he thought she might not know, might have wandered into the wrong section like a lost child. The first-class cabin was a sanctuary of cream leather and polished wood accents. 8 seats in a 2x2 configuration, each wider than some apartment chairs, with enough legroom to stretch completely. Abigail found her window seat, 2A, and settled in with relief. She tucked her backpack under the seat in front of her, pulled out her noise-canceling headphones, and closed her eyes. The seat embraced her like a hug. For the first time since landing in the United States that morning, she felt like she could breathe. 5 minutes passed in blessed quiet. Then she heard the voice that would change everything. "Excuse me, there must be some mistake." The voice dripped with old money and older prejudices. Abigail opened her eyes to find Adelaide standing in the aisle, one hand on her hip, the other clutching a Louis Vuitton carry-on that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. The woman was perhaps 50, with highlighted blonde hair styled in that expensive way that looked effortless but required hours and hundreds of dollars to achieve. She wore a cream-colored fur coat despite the mild Atlanta weather, diamonds glinting at her ears and throat and wrists. Her makeup was flawless, her manicure fresh, her expression one of absolute entitlement. Adelaide's seat was 2B, directly next to Abigail. The woman stared at Abigail with unconcealed horror, as if she had discovered a cockroach in her salad. "This person cannot possibly be in first class," Adelaide announced, not to Abigail but to Aaron, who had materialized instantly at her elbow. The other first-class passengers turned to watch entertainment before takeoff. Adelaide made no effort to lower her voice. "I specifically requested this flight because of its standards. I paid $15,000 for this seat. I will not sit next to someone who clearly does not belong here." The emphasis on someone made clear she meant someone black. Abigail felt every eye in the cabin lock onto her. Heat crept up her neck despite the airplane's air conditioning. This was happening. Again. Always again. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass?" Aaron asked Abigail, his voice professionally polite but his eyes already siding with Adelaide. Abigail handed it over without a word. Aaron examined it with the same exaggerated scrutiny as the check-in agent, as if the legitimate boarding pass might suddenly reveal itself as a forgery under his gaze. "The boarding pass appears valid," Aaron admitted reluctantly, handing it back. "But perhaps we can find you another seat to make everyone more comfortable." "I am comfortable," Abigail said quietly but firmly. "I paid for this specific seat." Adelaide's face flushed red. She turned to the other first-class passengers like a lawyer addressing a jury. "Can you believe this? The nerve. I know the CEO of this airline personally. When I tell him about this, heads will roll. Standards have completely fallen. They'll let anyone in these days if they scrounge up enough money from who knows where." An older white man across the aisle nodded in agreement. "She's got a point. First class used to mean something. Now they're just trying to fill seats with whoever." A woman in her 40s with perfect highlights chimed in. "I've noticed the same thing. It's really become quite uncomfortable to fly anymore." They spoke about Abigail as if she were not sitting 3 feet away, as if she were an object to be debated rather than a human being who could hear every word. Abigail's hands clenched in her lap. She wanted to scream, to demand they see her degrees, her business achievements, her bank statements. She wanted to ask what made them so certain they belonged here more than she did. But she knew from experience that defending herself would only confirm their prejudices. The angry black woman. The aggressive one. The one who did not know her place. So she sat silent, her jaw tight, her eyes forward, while they debated her right to exist in this space. Aaron disappeared toward the front galley, returning with 2 more flight attendants, both white women who looked at Abigail with that mixture of pity and suspicion that somehow felt worse than open hostility. "Perhaps we could offer you a complimentary upgrade on your next flight if you'd be willing to move to coach today," one suggested with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Just to keep the peace." Before Abigail could respond, Adelaide pulled out her cell phone with theatrical flourish. She dialed with French manicured nails, her voice carrying through the cabin. "Abraham?" "Yes, it's Adelaide Whitmore. I'm on your airline right now and there's a situation. A black girl is causing problems in first class and the staff won't handle it properly. I need you to come resolve this immediately or I'm calling the press and my lawyer." The atmosphere in the first-class cabin transformed from uncomfortable to explosive in seconds. Adelaide stood in the aisle, phone pressed to her ear, speaking loudly enough for passengers 3 rows back in coach to hear every word. "I don't care that you're in the terminal, Abraham. Get on this plane now. I have been a platinum member for 12 years and I am not about to be disrespected like this." She ended the call with a satisfied smirk, looking at Abigail with unconcealed triumph. Aaron hovered nearby, clearly relieved that someone with more authority was coming to handle the situation. The other flight attendants exchanged glances, one of them, a young black woman named Keisha, looking at Abigail with sympathy but saying nothing. Keisha's silence hurt almost more than the others' actions because Abigail understood it. Speaking up could cost her job, and jobs were not easy to come by. Abigail remained seated, her hands folded on the armrest, her breathing controlled. She had pulled out her phone and was recording audio in her pocket, a habit she had developed after too many incidents where it became her word against theirs. The cabin grew silent except for Adelaide's sharp breathing and the rustle of other passengers shifting in their seats to watch. Within 5 minutes, heavy footsteps echoed from the jet bridge. Abraham entered the aircraft with the bearing of someone used to wielding power. He was in his late 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver hair and a suit that screamed executive authority. Behind him came 2 airport security officers, their presence immediately making the situation feel criminal. Abraham surveyed the cabin with the practiced eye of someone assessing a problem to be solved. His gaze landed on Abigail, and she saw his expression harden almost imperceptibly. Whatever Adelaide had told him on the phone had already shaped his perception. "Mrs. Whitmore, I apologize for this inconvenience," Abraham said, his voice smooth and deferential as he addressed Adelaide. "We'll have this resolved immediately." He turned to Abigail, and his entire demeanor changed. The warmth vanished, replaced by cold authority. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to deplane. You're disrupting the flight and making other passengers uncomfortable." Abigail's voice remained steady despite the rage building in her chest. "What exactly have I done wrong? I have a valid ticket, I checked in properly, and I've been sitting quietly in my assigned seat. The only disruption has been this woman's refusal to sit next to a black person." The words hung in the air. Several passengers gasped. Adelaide's face turned crimson. "How dare you?" Adelaide shrieked. "This has nothing to do with race. You're being aggressive and threatening, and I feel unsafe." "I haven't moved from my seat or raised my voice once," Abigail replied calmly, though her heart hammered. "Multiple people can verify that." Abraham held up his hand as if Abigail's words were merely noise to be silenced. "Ma'am, I don't want to make this more difficult than it needs to be. We have policies about passenger comfort and crew discretion. You can deplane voluntarily, or we can have security escort you off and you'll be banned from this airline. Your choice." Around them, phones had appeared. At least 6 passengers were recording now, though Abigail noticed they were all filming her, not Adelaide, as if she were the spectacle, the problem, the one whose behavior needed documenting. She thought about her options. She could refuse, force them to physically remove her, create a bigger scene. But she knew how that would play out. She would be painted as the aggressor, the difficult passenger, possibly even charged with interfering with a flight crew. The videos would be edited to show her resistance, not what led to it. Or she could leave with what dignity remained, document everything, and fight this battle on her own terms. Abraham misread her silence as compliance. "Security will escort you to collect any checked baggage. There's a flight tomorrow morning with available seats in coach. We'll get you rebooked." "I don't want coach," Abigail said quietly. "I paid for first class." "That's not really your decision anymore, is it?" Abraham's smile was patronizing, the kind reserved for children and people he considered beneath him. He nodded to the security officers. Albert, the same guard from earlier, stepped forward with his partner, a younger man who looked uncomfortable but followed orders anyway. "Let's make this easy," Albert said, his hand moving to hover near the handcuffs on his belt, a subtle threat. Adelaide settled into her seat with a contented sigh, already signaling to Aaron for champagne as if the matter were resolved to her satisfaction. The other first-class passengers watched with a mixture of fascination and approval, comfortable in their belief that order was being restored, that the interloper was being removed, that their exclusive space was being protected from invasion. Abigail stood slowly, gathering her backpack with deliberate movements. She looked directly at Abraham, memorizing his face, his name tag, the smug certainty in his expression. She glanced at Aaron, at the flight attendants who had done nothing, at Adelaide who sipped champagne like she was toasting victory. And she looked at Keisha, the young black flight attendant, and saw tears gathering in the corners of her eyes that she quickly blinked away. As Abigail walked down the aisle toward the aircraft door, every step felt like a mile. The security officers flanked her as if she were dangerous, as if she had committed some crime beyond existing in a space where she was not wanted. Passengers in coach craned their necks to see what was happening. She heard whispers follow her like a wake. What did she do? Must have done something bad to get kicked off. Probably didn't have a real ticket. The jet bridge stretched ahead, fluorescent lights harsh overhead. Abigail's hands trembled, but she kept them steady, kept her head high, kept walking. Behind her, she heard the aircraft door seal shut with a pneumatic hiss, the sound of her exclusion becoming final. The jet bridge felt like a tunnel to humiliation, each step echoing against the metal walls. Albert walked on Abigail's right, his partner on her left, their presence broadcasting to everyone they passed that she was someone who required guarding, someone potentially dangerous. They emerged into the terminal where holiday travelers packed every available space, and hundreds of eyes turned to watch this young black woman being escorted by airport security. Parents instinctively pulled their children closer. A little boy, maybe 6 years old, asked in that piercing voice children have, "Mommy, why is that lady getting arrested?" His mother, a white woman in yoga pants and a cashmere sweater, whispered back but not quietly enough, "Because she did something bad, honey. That's why you always have to follow the rules." Abigail wanted to stop, to explain she had not done anything wrong, but the security officers kept her moving forward with unspoken pressure. They passed gate after gate, and at each one, conversations stopped, phones came out, fingers pointed. She was being marked, labeled, turned into a spectacle and a cautionary tale. They walked through the main terminal toward the security checkpoint exit, and Abigail saw something that made her chest tighten. In the seating area near gate D38, at least 24 black passengers sat waiting for their flights. They watched her being escorted past, and she saw recognition in their eyes. Not recognition of her specifically, but recognition of the situation, the familiar pattern, the lived experience they all shared. An elderly black woman, perhaps 70 years old, sat in a wheelchair near the gate. She wore a church hat decorated with silk flowers and a coat that had seen better days but was immaculately maintained. As Abigail passed, the woman's eyes filled with tears. She reached out one wrinkled hand as if to offer comfort across the distance between them. Her voice, soft and filled with generations of pain, carried clearly. "I'm so sorry, baby. This is still our America." Those words cracked something in Abigail's carefully maintained composure. Her own eyes burned, but she refused to let the tears fall, not here, not in front of all these people who were already convinced of her guilt. A black man in his 30s, wearing a business suit and carrying a briefcase, caught her eye. He shook his head slowly, his jaw clenched, his own rage and helplessness visible. How many times had he been in similar situations, questioned, doubted, excluded? A young black mother held her daughter, maybe 10 years old, close. The girl's eyes were wide, taking it all in, learning the lesson that was being taught whether anyone intended it or not. Some spaces were not meant for people who looked like them, no matter how much they belonged there legally or financially or morally. The security officers led Abigail down an escalator, through another corridor, and finally to a small office marked Security Operations. The room was windowless and sterile, with fluorescent lights that hummed overhead and a metal desk bolted to the floor. Albert gestured to a plastic chair while his partner stood by the door. "We need to ask you some questions," Albert said, pulling out a form and a pen. For the next 30 minutes, they interrogated her. Had she threatened anyone? No. Had she refused to follow crew instructions? No. Had she been drinking? No. Had she purchased the ticket with her own funds? Yes. Could she prove it? She showed them her credit card statement on her phone. Why was she flying first class? Because she wanted to. That answer seemed to bother them more than it should have. They ran her identification through multiple databases, looking for anything that might justify what had happened, any past incident or outstanding warrant or reason to paint her as the problem. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. Abigail Thompson had never been arrested, never had so much as a speeding ticket, held 3 degrees including an MBA from Wharton, and had a credit score north of 800. On paper, she was exactly the kind of passenger airlines courted. But paper did not reflect skin color, and skin color, in that moment, was all that mattered. While she sat in that cold room answering questions designed to make her feel like a criminal, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it during a pause and saw notifications flooding in. The flight she was supposed to be on had departed. Gate D42, on-time departure, destination Detroit. Adelaide was probably settled into seat 2B, spreading out across both seats now that the undesirable neighbor had been removed. Aaron was probably serving her another champagne. Abraham had probably already forgotten her face. But Abigail would never forget any of them. When they finally decided they had no grounds to hold her, Albert gave her a document that made her blood run cold. "You've been flagged in our system as a possible troublemaker. Future bookings may require additional verification." Just like that, with no due process, no hearing, no appeal, she had been branded. One incident, in which she was the victim, had somehow transformed her into the perpetrator in the official record. She walked out of the security office into the main terminal, and her reflection in a store window caught her eye. She looked the same as when she had arrived at the airport hours ago. Same hoodie, same jeans, same backpack, same face. But something fundamental had shifted. The invisible wound of racism had been reopened, salt poured generously. Abigail pulled out her phone with shaking hands and called Adam Peterson, her personal attorney and one of the few people who knew the full truth about her business holdings. He answered on the first ring. "Abigail, everything okay? Aren't you supposed to be in the air?" "Adam, I need you to arrange an emergency board meeting." Her voice was steady now, cold with purpose. "Tomorrow morning. All executives. Mandatory attendance." What happened? He sounded concerned, alert. "Tell them the owner is coming." She ended the call and stood there in the middle of Atlanta's busiest airport, surrounded by thousands of travelers rushing to make their holiday flights. Above her, a departure board flickered, updating gates and times and destinations. She thought about the 9 other complaints she had recently learned about, 9 other black passengers who had been discriminated against on her airline in recent months, incidents that had been buried and dismissed by the very executives she paid to run her company with integrity. Have you or someone you know ever been discriminated against while traveling? Drop a comment with the number 1 if you think Abigail should expose everyone involved in what happened to her. Hit that like button if you believe it's time for real consequences when people abuse their power. Subscribe because what Abigail does next will shock you, and you won't want to miss how she makes them all pay for their prejudice. Now, here's the question that changes everything. What would you do if you discovered that the people you trusted to run your company were the same ones discriminating against people who look like you? Keep watching to find out exactly how Abigail answers that question. Abigail's penthouse apartment overlooked downtown Atlanta from the 40th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city lights twinkling like stars brought down to earth. The space was decorated in minimalist modern style with African art providing splashes of color against white walls. On any other night, this view calmed her, reminded her how far she had come. Tonight, it felt hollow. She stood by those windows still wearing the same hoodie from the airport, watching planes take off from Hartsfield-Jackson in the distance, tiny lights ascending into the darkness. One of those planes might have been her flight, the one she should have been on, arriving in Detroit right about now where her parents and younger brother waited to pick her up. Instead, she had called them from the airport to explain she would catch a flight tomorrow, keeping her voice light and casual because she could not bear to tell them what really happened. Not yet. Not until she had turned this humiliation into something meaningful. Her laptop sat open on the glass coffee table, multiple windows displaying security footage, booking records, employee files, and complaint logs. Adam had worked quickly, sending encrypted files within an hour of her call. As her attorney and the only non-family member who knew she owned Skybridge Airlines, he had access to everything. Abigail poured herself a glass of wine and began reviewing the evidence of her own airline's betrayal. The video from the airplane was damning. From multiple angles, she watched herself sitting quietly in seat 2A while Adelaide berated her. She watched Aaron's face, saw the moment he made his decision to side with Adelaide before even investigating. She watched Abraham arrive with security, his body language screaming that he had already decided she was the problem before hearing a single word from her. The audio was even worse. With headphones on, she could hear every slur, every insinuation, every assumption about her character based solely on her skin color. She heard Adelaide's voice dripping with disgust when she said, "Someone who clearly doesn't belong here." She heard the older man agreeing about standards falling. She heard Abraham's patronizing tone when he told her, "That's not really your decision anymore, is it?" as if she were a child being disciplined. But the videos and audio from yesterday's incident were just the beginning. Adam had pulled complaint records going back 18 months, and what Abigail discovered made her sick. There were not 9 complaints. There were 23. 23 separate incidents where black passengers reported discrimination on Skybridge Airlines. A grandmother flying to her son's funeral was moved from first class to make room for a white standby passenger despite having a confirmed reservation. A black businessman was accused of stealing headphones that were provided free to all first-class passengers. A teenage girl was interrogated about whether her ticket was really hers when flying alone to visit her father. A black couple on their honeymoon was asked to switch seats to accommodate a white family who did not want to be separated, even though the couple had paid extra for their specific seats. Over and over, the pattern repeated. Black passengers questioned, doubted, moved, inconvenienced, humiliated. And every single complaint had been marked as resolved internally, without any meaningful investigation or consequence for the employees involved. Abigail clicked through personnel files next. Aaron Matthews had worked for Skybridge for 6 years, promoted to lead flight attendant 3 years ago despite multiple complaints about his attitude toward minority passengers. Each complaint had been dismissed as a misunderstanding or difference in communication styles. Abraham Wilson had been airport director at the Atlanta hub for 3 years, hired based on a recommendation from someone on the board of directors. His employee reviews were sterling, but Abigail now noticed that all the reviews were from other white executives. There was no feedback from the diverse ground staff who actually worked under him daily. She pulled up the broader employee satisfaction surveys and found something telling. White employees at Skybridge rated their experience an average of 8.7 out of 10. Black employees rated theirs at 5.2. That 4-point gap represented a culture of discrimination so embedded that people had learned to accept it as normal. The airline industry had always struggled with diversity, but Abigail had fooled herself into thinking her airline would be different because she owned it. Now she understood her mistake. She had built the structure but then stepped back, remaining anonymous, operating through lawyers and investment firms, believing that good policies and diverse hiring practices would be enough. But policies on paper meant nothing when the people implementing them brought their prejudices to work every day. Abigail opened another window showing Skybridge's financial records. 3 years ago, she had purchased the failing airline for $70 million of her own money, earned through a tech startup she had founded in college and sold for a fortune before she turned 25. She had poured another $30 million into renovations, new planes, better training programs, and competitive wages. She had insisted on diversity initiatives, inclusive policies, and anonymous complaint systems. And despite all that investment, despite all those good intentions, her airline had become a place where people who looked like her were treated as suspicious intruders rather than valued customers. Her phone buzzed with a message from Adam. Board meeting confirmed for 8 a.m. tomorrow. Told the mandatory attendance, no exceptions. They're nervous about meeting the mystery owner. What's the plan? Abigail typed back quickly. The plan is honesty. Complete, uncomfortable, career-ending honesty. She spent the next 3 hours compiling a presentation. Every complaint, every video, every data point showing the systemic nature of the discrimination. She organized it chronologically, showing how complaints had actually increased over the past year despite policies meant to prevent them. She prepared termination papers for Aaron, Abraham, and 3 other executives who had consistently dismissed complaints. She drafted a new company-wide training program on racial bias, mandatory for every single employee from the CEO down to the baggage handlers. She outlined a new complaint process with external oversight and real consequences. And she prepared her own statement, the words she would say when she revealed herself as the owner they had discriminated against. By 3 in the morning, Abigail's eyes burned and her back ached from hunching over the laptop, but the presentation was complete. 50 slides of evidence, analysis, and action plans. She saved it with a file name that made her smile grimly. Christmas Reckoning. She finally lay down on her bed without bothering to change clothes, staring at the ceiling while her mind raced. In less than 5 hours, she would walk into that boardroom and detonate a bomb that would change everything. Some of those executives would lose their jobs. Some might face lawsuits. The story would definitely go public, and with it would come scrutiny of her, questions about why she had stayed anonymous, accusations that she was playing a victim for publicity. But none of that mattered compared to the 23 people who had been mistreated and the thousands more who might be spared that experience if she acted now. Abigail thought about her grandmother, who had lived through Jim Crow and the civil rights movement, who had told stories about being forced to the back of buses and denied service at restaurants. Baby, her grandmother had said before she passed, every generation has to fight the same battles in new clothes. Don't ever think we've won just because the signs came down. The spirit that put those signs up is still alive, just wearing a suit and tie now. Tomorrow, Abigail would confront that spirit wearing its suit and tie, sitting in a boardroom, defending its right to decide who belonged and who did not. She set her alarm for 6 a.m. and closed her eyes, though sleep did not come easy. The Skybridge Airlines corporate headquarters occupied the top 5 floors of a glass and steel tower in downtown Atlanta. The executive boardroom on the 20th floor was designed to impress, with a massive oak table that could seat 20, original artwork on the walls, and windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. At 7:45 in the morning on December 24, 12 executives gathered around a table in various states of confusion and anxiety. The email from Adam Peterson, sent at 11 p.m. the previous night, had been brief and mysterious. Mandatory board meeting, 8 a.m. sharp. The owner will be in attendance. Prepare to discuss company policies regarding customer service and discrimination complaints. Most of them had never met the owner, knew nothing beyond rumors and speculation. When Skybridge had been purchased 3 years ago, all communication had gone through lawyers and investment firms. The new owner had appointed a CEO, approved budgets, and otherwise remained invisible. Some board members theorized it was a tech billionaire wanting a hobby. Others guessed at a consortium of investors pooling resources. A few wondered if it might be a foreign entity using American fronts. None of them suspected the truth. Abraham sat near the middle of the table, his suit freshly pressed, his confidence intact despite a flutter of nervousness. He had gotten Adelaide's text late last night, her gushing thanks for handling that situation so perfectly. He felt secure in his actions. The owner would surely understand that customer satisfaction, especially from platinum members like Adelaide, had to be the priority. Aaron arrived at 7:50, impeccable in his uniform despite having worked a late flight the previous evening. He had been surprised by the meeting summons but assumed it was routine year-end business, perhaps discussion of holiday bonuses or next year's routes. He grabbed a coffee from the sideboard and chatted casually with another manager about vacation plans. The CEO, a man named Richard Sterling, sat at the head of the table looking more nervous than anyone else. He had received a separate email from Adam with attachments he was instructed not to open until the meeting began. That unusual instruction had kept him awake most of the night wondering what crisis was about to unfold. At 7:58, the side door to the boardroom opened and Adam Peterson entered, followed by two other lawyers from his firm. They carried boxes of documents and set up a laptop connected to the large screen on the wall. Adam was a tall black man in his 40s, with silver streaking his close-cropped hair and the bearing of someone who had won a lot of courtroom battles. He nodded politely to the assembled executives but said nothing, simply arranging papers with methodical precision. "Can you tell us what this is about?" Richard asked, his voice betraying his anxiety. "The owner will be here in 1 minute," Adam replied, checking his watch. "All questions should be directed to her." Her. That one word sent a ripple around the table. Several executives exchanged glances. A female owner was not what they had expected, and the implications began shifting their assumptions. The side door opened again at exactly 8 a.m. Abigail walked in, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. She wore a black power suit tailored perfectly to her frame, her hair pulled back in a sleek bun, diamond studs in her ears that caught the morning light. She carried a leather portfolio and wore heels that brought her to 5'9". She looked every inch the successful executive, polished and professional and utterly in command. And completely, unmistakably, the same young woman Abraham had thrown off a plane yesterday. Abraham's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. His face went from confident to confused to horrified in the space of 3 seconds. Aaron's mouth fell open, and he made a small choking sound as if he had forgotten how to breathe. Around the table, executives who had not been at the airport yesterday still looked confused, but those who followed the news or social media began recognizing Abigail from photos. She was Abigail Thompson, the tech prodigy who had sold her first company for $300 million at age 24. She was one of Forbes' 30 under 30. She was a rising star in the business world who had suddenly gone quiet 2 years ago. And apparently, she was the owner of Skybridge Airlines. Abigail walked to the head of the table, directly across from Richard. She set down her portfolio, pulled out the chair, and sat with deliberate slowness, letting the moment stretch, letting their discomfort build. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, controlled, and cold as winter ice. "Good morning. My name is Abigail Thompson. I am the sole owner of Skybridge Airlines, which I purchased 3 years ago for $70 million. I've remained anonymous until now because I wanted this company to succeed or fail on its own merits, not because of my involvement." She paused, looking directly at Abraham. He had gone pale, his hand trembling slightly as he set down his coffee cup. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the room's comfortable temperature. "Yesterday, December 23, I attempted to board Flight 742 from Atlanta to Detroit. I had a first-class ticket, Seat 2A, which I purchased with my personal credit card for $3,000. Before I even boarded, I was subjected to additional screening, had my ticket questioned, and was treated with suspicion by multiple employees despite having done absolutely nothing wrong. Adelaide, who had been invited to the meeting as a key witness, without being told what she would be witnessing, made a small squeaking sound. She sat near the far end of the table, her designer purse clutched in her lap like a shield. Her face had gone from powdered pale to splotchy red as realization crashed over her. Abigail continued, her voice never rising but somehow filling every corner of the room. "When I boarded the aircraft, I was confronted by a passenger, Adelaide Whitmore, who is sitting at the end of this table. Mrs. Whitmore loudly proclaimed that I could not possibly belong in first class, that standards had fallen, and that she refused to sit next to me. Rather than investigating or attempting to mediate, the lead flight attendant, Aaron Matthews, immediately began trying to convince me to give up my seat. Aaron looked like he might vomit. His carefully styled hair seemed to wilt, and his hands gripped the armrests of his chair as if he might fall without that anchor. When I politely but firmly declined to give up the seat I had paid for, Mrs. Whitmore called Abraham Wilson, our airport director at the Atlanta hub. Mr. Wilson arrived with security and, without asking me a single question about my version of events, ordered me removed from the aircraft. I was escorted through the terminal in front of hundreds of witnesses, taken to a security office, interrogated for 30 minutes, and then flagged in our system as a troublemaker. Abraham tried to speak. "Ma'am, there was a complaint, and we have to take passenger safety seriously." Abigail held up one hand, and he fell silent immediately. "Mr. Wilson, I'm not finished. After my attorneys pulled our records last night, I discovered that what happened to me was not an isolated incident. Over the past 18 months, we have received 23 formal complaints from black passengers about discrimination. 23. Would anyone like to guess how many of those complaints resulted in employee discipline? Silence. No one wanted to answer that question. 0, Abigail said softly. Not one. Every complaint was marked resolved internally, without any meaningful investigation or consequence. We have built a culture where discrimination is tolerated, even enabled, as long as it keeps certain passengers happy. Abigail stood and moved to the laptop, pulling up her presentation on the large screen. The first slide showed yesterday's date and a photo of Flight 742. Let's watch what happened, shall we? The video began playing. From multiple angles captured by security cameras and passenger phones, the boardroom watched Abigail sitting quietly in her seat. They watched Adelaide's performance, her theatrical outrage, her entitled demands. They heard every word, crystal clear, as Adelaide proclaimed that Abigail clearly did not belong in first class, that standards had fallen, that she knew the CEO personally and would have heads rolling. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Richard's face had gone pale as he realized how bad this looked, how indefensible. They watched Aaron's response, saw him immediately side with Adelaide without even pretending to be neutral. They heard him suggest that Abigail give up her seat, to avoid trouble, as if she were the source of the trouble rather than the victim of it. Then came Abraham's entrance, his immediate assumption of authority, his dismissive tone when speaking to Abigail, his patronizing smile. The video captured the moment when he told her, "That's not really your decision anymore, is it?" and the casual cruelty in those words was impossible to deny. When the video ended with Abigail being escorted off the plane, the boardroom sat in absolute silence. Even the sound of breathing seemed too loud. "That's what discrimination looks like in 2025, Abigail said quietly. No one used a slur. No one wore a hood. But the message was identical to what my grandparents faced 60 years ago. You don't belong here. Know your place. We will remove you if you don't comply." She advanced to the next slide, showing a compilation of the 23 complaints. Each one appeared as a brief summary, names redacted for privacy, but the pattern was unmistakable. A 67-year-old woman flying to her son's funeral was bumped from first class for a white standby passenger despite having a confirmed paid reservation. When she complained, she was told it was a computer error. It wasn't. The gate agent made a manual override. Next slide. A black businessman in his 40s was accused of stealing the complimentary headphones provided to all first-class passengers. He had to show his boarding pass 3 times before they believed the headphones were his to keep. No white passenger has ever reported being questioned about taking amenity items. Next slide. A teenage girl flying alone was interrogated for 20 minutes because the gate agent didn't believe a black teenager could afford a first-class ticket. They called her father to verify, as if a 17-year-old needed parental permission to fly despite being legally allowed to travel independently. The slides continued, each one more damning than the last. Abigail narrated each complaint with clinical precision, and with each story, more executives found reasons to study their hands or the table rather than look at her or the screen. Adelaide had begun crying, makeup running down her cheeks in dark streaks. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear I didn't know who you were. I'm not a racist. I have black friends. My cleaning lady is black, and I give her Christmas bonuses every year. The sheer tone deafness of that statement made several people wince. Abigail turned her full attention to Adelaide for the first time since beginning the presentation. Mrs. Whitmore, the fact that you didn't know who I was is exactly the point. You didn't think any black person belonged in first class. It didn't matter if I was the owner, a doctor, a lawyer, or a teacher. In your mind, black people are cleaning ladies who receive bonuses for their service, not equals who might sit next to you on a plane. Adelaide sobbed harder, but Abigail felt no sympathy. This woman had sat smugly in a seat that should have been next to hers, sipping champagne in celebration of having successfully removed an undesirable, never once considering that she might be wrong. Aaron finally found his voice, desperate and shaking. Ms. Thompson, please, I was just doing my job. We're trained to handle passenger complaints, to de-escalate situations, to find compromises. I didn't think I was discriminating. I thought I was keeping the peace. You were keeping a specific kind of peace, Abigail replied. The kind that prioritizes the comfort of white passengers over the dignity of black ones. When Mrs. Whitmore complained, you immediately assumed she was right. You never asked me what happened. You never considered that perhaps the problem was her prejudice, not my presence. That's not de-escalation. That's taking sides. She pulled up another slide showing Aaron's employment record. You've had 6 complaints in your tenure here about how you treat minority passengers. 6. Each time, your supervisors noted that you were professional, and the complaints were unsubstantiated. But here's what actually happened. Each time, you were believed and the passengers were dismissed. Their word against yours, and you had the uniform, so you won. Aaron's face crumpled. He looked around the table for support, for someone to defend him, but found only carefully averted gazes. Everyone was suddenly very interested in protecting themselves. Abraham tried a different approach, his voice taking on a pleading tone. Ms. Thompson, I understand you're upset, and you have every right to be. But from my position, I received a call from a longtime Platinum member reporting a disturbance. I came to assess the situation. When I arrived, there was clearly a conflict between passengers. My job is to ensure safe operations, and that sometimes means making difficult decisions in the moment. I was trying to prevent the situation from escalating. You made a decision based on assumptions about race, Abigail said flatly. You saw a well-dressed white woman and a young black woman in a hoodie, and you immediately decided who was the problem. That's not security. That's prejudice dressed up as professionalism. She clicked to the next slide, showing Abraham's department statistics. Under your leadership at the Atlanta hub, complaints about discrimination have increased 40%. Minority passenger satisfaction is down. Minority employee satisfaction is down. But Platinum member retention is up, so management never questioned your methods. They never asked why those numbers were improving or what trade-offs were being made. Richard finally spoke, his voice hoarse. Ms. Thompson, on behalf of the entire executive team, I want to apologize. This is unacceptable. We clearly failed in our oversight and in creating the culture you envisioned. What can we do to make this right? Abigail turned to face him fully, and her expression was granite. You can start by understanding that this isn't about making it right with me. I'm the owner. I'll be fine. This is about the 23 other people who were discriminated against and didn't have the power to fight back. This is about every black passenger who chose a different airline because they'd heard stories about how they might be treated on ours. This is about the culture we built, even if we didn't mean to. She pulled out a folder from her portfolio, setting copies in front of each executive. These are termination papers. Mr. Wilson, effective immediately, you are no longer employed by Skybridge Airlines. Your severance package will be the legal minimum. Mr. Matthews, same for you. Mrs. Whitmore, you're being banned from this airline for life, and we're filing a formal complaint with the FAA about your behavior. Adelaide's wailing intensified, but Abigail ignored her completely. She continued down the list. For the rest of you who allowed this culture to exist, who dismissed complaints without investigation, who prioritized profit over people, you have 30 days. 30 days to prove to me that you understand what went wrong and that you're capable of fixing it. You'll attend mandatory bias training. You'll implement the new complaint system outlined in these documents. You'll meet weekly with an external consultant who will audit your decision-making. And if in 30 days I don't see real, measurable change, you'll join Mr. Wilson and Mr. Matthews in the unemployment line. The room erupted in protests and pleas. Abraham was begging now, talking about his family, his mortgage, his reputation. Aaron promised he would change, would do better, would take any training they wanted. Adelaide was calling her lawyer, her voice shrill and panicked, threatening lawsuits for defamation and discrimination against her. Abigail let them talk, let them plead and threaten and bargain. She stood there, arms crossed, face impassive, until the noise gradually died down as they realized she was not going to be moved by their desperation. When silence finally returned, she spoke one last time. I built this airline because I was tired of being discriminated against when I flew. I wanted to create a space where everyone was treated with dignity regardless of their skin color. What I learned yesterday is that good intentions aren't enough. Policies aren't enough. Diversity initiatives aren't enough. Culture changes one decision at a time, one incident at a time, one person at a time. And the change starts right now, with consequences for the people who violated that culture. She closed her portfolio and walked toward the door. Adam and his team followed, carrying their boxes of evidence. At the doorway, Abigail paused and looked back at the shell-shocked executives. "Merry Christmas," she said, and there was no warmth in it, only bitter irony. "May you spend the holiday thinking about how many other people's holidays you've ruined with your prejudice." The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded like thunder. The story hit the national news within 24 hours. Someone in that boardroom, despite signing non-disclosure agreements, had leaked details to the media. By December 26, Abigail's face was on every news channel, newspaper, and social media platform in America. Airline owner kicked off her own plane, read one headline. Discrimination at 30,000 feet, proclaimed another. The video from the airplane went viral, reaching 20 million views in the first 48 hours. People who never flew or cared about airlines suddenly had opinions about racism in aviation. The hashtag #FlyingWhileBlack began trending as thousands of black passengers shared their own experiences of discrimination in airports and on planes. A woman in Chicago described being told she couldn't bring her service dog on board despite having all the proper documentation, only to watch a white passenger with a similar dog board without question. A man in Los Angeles posted about being stopped and searched 5 times in 1 year while traveling for business, always asked if the laptop he carried was really his. A college student shared her story of being moved from first class because the white woman next to her complained that her natural hair took up too much space and she refused to tie it back. On and on the stories poured in, thousands of them, a tidal wave of experiences that had been dismissed or ignored or chalked up to bad luck rather than systemic prejudice. But Abigail's story was different because she had the power to fight back, and she was using it. Major news outlets wanted interviews. Abigail did them all, sitting in studios and speaking calmly about systemic racism in corporate America, about how discrimination often wore a professional smile, about how change required more than just good intentions. Adrian Fletcher, an investigative journalist for a major newspaper, spent 2 weeks digging deeper. His series of articles exposed similar problems across the entire airline industry. He found data showing black passengers were disproportionately selected for additional screening, more likely to be bumped from flights, more likely to have their tickets questioned, and less likely to have complaints taken seriously. His reporting forced congressional hearings and prompted the Department of Transportation to launch formal investigations into multiple airlines. Adelaide Whitmore became an unwilling poster child for entitled racism. Her social media posts from previous years were dug up and analyzed, revealing a pattern of casual prejudice. She had complained about those people moving into her neighborhood, shared articles about urban crime, and once posted that she was colorblind and didn't see race, which was promptly torn apart by commenters explaining that claiming not to see race was itself a form of dismissal of the real discrimination people of color faced. Her husband's political career imploded. The consulting firm where Adelaide held a nominal position as image consultant fired her immediately. She became radioactive, her name synonymous with the kind of prejudice most people wanted to believe no longer existed in modern America. Aaron Matthews never worked in aviation again. His termination was widely reported, and every airline he applied to found reasons not to hire him. He eventually had to leave Atlanta entirely, moving to a small town where his past was less well known, taking a job in retail that paid a fraction of his former salary. Some people felt sorry for him, arguing that he had made a mistake and deserved a second chance. Others pointed out that his mistake was being complicit in discrimination, and that actions had consequences. Abraham Wilson faced multiple investigations from aviation authorities and civil rights organizations. His career in airport management was over. He tried to frame himself as a victim, giving interviews where he claimed he was just following protocols and had been unfairly scapegoated. But the protocols he cited did not actually exist, and recordings of other airport directors explaining how they would have handled the same situation made clear that Abraham's choices were his own, not organizational requirements. While individuals faced consequences, Abigail focused on institutional change. She hired Dr. Patricia Washington, a renowned expert on diversity and inclusion, as Skybridge's first chief diversity officer. Dr. Washington had a Ph.D. in organizational psychology and 20 years of experience dismantling racist structures in corporations. She came with a reputation for not accepting token positions or cosmetic changes, and Abigail gave her unprecedented authority. Every employee at Skybridge Airlines, from the executives to the baggage handlers, went through mandatory 8-hour bias training. Not the superficial kind where everyone watches a video and checks a box, but intensive workshops with role-playing, difficult conversations, and real accountability. Flight attendants practiced de-escalation scenarios where they had to confront their own assumptions about passengers. Gate agents learned to recognize when they were making decisions based on stereotypes rather than actual behavior. The complaints process was completely overhauled. Previously, complaints went to the department being complained about, an obvious conflict of interest. Now, a third-party organization specializing in civil rights handled all discrimination complaints. They had subpoena power to access internal documents and communications. Employees knew that dismissing complaints casually was no longer an option. Abigail also established the Equal Skies Initiative, a nonprofit funded with $5 million of her own money. The organization provided legal support for passengers who experienced discrimination on any airline, not just Skybridge. They tracked incidents, published annual reports showing which airlines had the worst records, and lobbied for stronger federal protections. The initiative also created the Fly Higher Scholarship Program, providing funding for Black students pursuing degrees in aviation, aerospace engineering, and hospitality management. The scholarships included mentorship, internships at Skybridge, and a pipeline to jobs in an industry that remained overwhelmingly white at all levels. Abigail went public with her ownership, giving up the anonymity she had maintained for 3 years. She became the face of Skybridge Airlines, appearing in commercials and on social media, her story of being discriminated against on her own airline becoming central to the company's rebranding. It was risky, tying the company so closely to one person and one incident, but it worked. Black passengers who had avoided flying began choosing Skybridge specifically because they felt safer. The company's customer base diversified rapidly. White passengers who valued inclusive policies also switched airlines. Within 6 months, Skybridge's revenue had increased 40%. 3 of the executives who had been given 30 days to prove themselves succeeded. They threw themselves into the cultural transformation, acknowledging their past failures and working alongside Dr. Washington to rebuild systems from the ground up. The other 9 were let go, their positions filled by a diverse slate of candidates who understood from personal experience why the work mattered. Keisha Robinson, the young black flight attendant who had watched Abigail being removed but had been too afraid to speak up, became an important voice in the transformation. Abigail sought her out personally, wanting to understand why good people stayed silent in the face of injustice. Keisha explained the fear of losing her job, of being labeled a troublemaker, of having her concerns dismissed by supervisors who would believe Aaron over her. Abigail promoted Keisha to a position in employee relations, giving her authority to advocate for other workers who faced similar dilemmas. Together, they created a whistleblower protection program that allowed employees to report problems without fear of retaliation. The program became a model for other airlines struggling with workplace culture issues. On Christmas Day, exactly 1 year after the incident that changed everything, Abigail stood in the Atlanta airport terminal watching passengers board a Skybridge flight to Detroit. She wore jeans and a hoodie again, deliberately echoing that fateful day, but this time airport staff recognized her and greeted her warmly. She watched a family of 4 check in at the counter, the black mother handing over first-class tickets for herself and her children. The agent processed them with a genuine smile and a warm, "Have a wonderful flight." No extra scrutiny, no questioning, just standard professional service. Abigail watched them board, then followed herself. She had booked seat 2A, the same seat from a year ago. A white woman in her 50s sat in 2B. When she saw Abigail, the woman smiled. "Great choice on the window seat. The sunset views on this route are beautiful this time of year." They chatted casually during boarding, 2 passengers sharing a row, nothing remarkable about it. That ordinariness, that simple normalcy of being treated as an equal, was exactly what Abigail had fought for. During the flight, Abigail walked back to coach, something she often did now. She wanted to see her airline from every angle, wanted to be accessible to passengers and crew. In row 24, she spotted a young black girl, maybe 10 years old, pressed against the window with wide eyes full of wonder. "Is this your first flight?" Abigail asked, crouching in the aisle. The girl nodded, too excited to speak. Her mother, sitting next to her, smiled. "First time for both of us. We're going to visit family for the holidays. My daughter wants to be a pilot someday." Abigail felt her throat tighten with emotion. She pulled out a business card and handed it to the mother. "Have her reach out to me when she's ready for college. Skybridge has a scholarship program for aspiring pilots." The little girl's eyes got even wider. "Really? I could really be a pilot?" "You can be anything you want," Abigail said firmly. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As she returned to her seat, Abigail thought about all the little girls who had grown up being told, implicitly or explicitly, that certain spaces were not for them. Some were told through outright discrimination. Others through the absence of representation, never seeing anyone who looked like them in positions of authority or success. Slowly, painfully, that was beginning to change. 1 year and 3 months after the incident that exposed systemic racism in her airline, Abigail Thompson sat in a leather chair facing the House Transportation Committee in Washington, D.C. The hearing room was ornate, with high ceilings and rows of seats filled with spectators, journalists, and advocates. Behind the raised bench, members of Congress looked down at her, some friendly, others skeptical, all intensely interested in what she had to say. The committee chairwoman, Representative Angela Martinez, opened the questioning. "Ms. Thompson, thank you for testifying today. Your experience on Flight 742 has sparked a national conversation about discrimination in aviation. Can you tell us what you've learned from your investigation into not just your own airline but the industry as a whole?" Abigail had prepared extensively for this moment. She pulled out a bound report, hundreds of pages of data and analysis compiled by her team and independent researchers. "Representative Martinez, what I've learned is that what happened to me was not an isolated incident, not an anomaly, but part of a pattern so pervasive that most people in the industry had simply accepted it as normal. Our research shows that 37% of black passengers report experiencing some form of discrimination while flying. 37%. That's not a few bad apples. That's a systemic failure. She walked the committee through the data. Black passengers were pulled aside for additional screening at rates far exceeding their percentage of the flying population. They were more likely to be bumped from flights when airlines overbooked. Their complaints were less likely to be taken seriously or result in compensation compared to identical complaints from white passengers. Black employees in the aviation industry reported hostile work environments, lack of advancement opportunities, and retaliation when they reported discrimination. The statistics painted a picture of an industry that had failed to reckon with its racial biases even as America had supposedly moved beyond the overtly segregated past. The laws changed 60 years ago, Abigail said, her voice steady but passionate. Black passengers can legally sit anywhere on a plane. But the attitudes that said we didn't belong in certain spaces never fully went away. They just became more subtle, more deniable, dressed up in language about safety and customer service and professional judgment. Representative Thomas Blackwell, one of 3 black members of Congress on the committee, leaned forward. Ms. Thompson, some critics argue that you're exaggerating the problem, that you had one bad experience and are using your platform to push an agenda. How do you respond to that? Abigail had expected this question. She pulled out her phone and held it up. Congressman, since my story went public 14 months ago, I've received over 8,000 emails from black passengers sharing their own experiences. 8,000. Some are dramatic incidents like mine. Many are smaller indignities. Being assumed to be in the wrong seat. Having tickets questioned. Being watched more closely than other passengers. Being passed over for upgrades. Small cuts, but death by 1,000 cuts is still death. She lowered the phone and looked directly at Blackwell. I'm not exaggerating. If anything, the scope of the problem is bigger than I initially understood because so many incidents go unreported. People accept discrimination as the price of travel. They don't complain because they don't think it will matter. And based on how complaints were handled before we changed our systems, they were right not to bother. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Abigail answered questions about Skybridge's reforms, about the costs and benefits of bias training, about how to balance passenger comfort with passenger rights, about the role of federal regulation versus industry self-policing. By the end, even the skeptical representatives seemed convinced that action was needed. 2 months later, Congress passed the Equal Skies Act, the first major aviation civil rights legislation in decades. The law required all airlines to implement bias training, created an independent oversight board to investigate discrimination complaints, established penalties for airlines with patterns of discriminatory behavior, and funded research into disparities in aviation. President Sarah Chin signed it in a White House ceremony where Abigail stood behind her, a symbol of how personal experience could drive policy change. The impact rippled far beyond aviation. Other industries began examining their own practices, asking whether they too had normalized discrimination without realizing it. Retail, hospitality, healthcare, education, all started conversations about how unconscious bias affected who got served, who got believed, who got opportunities. Not everyone was happy about the changes. Some people complained about political correctness and thought police. Right-wing media painted Abigail as a race baiter who had destroyed careers over a misunderstanding. Death threats arrived regularly enough that she needed security. But the complaints and threats only reinforced why the work mattered, because they revealed how threatened some people felt by the simple demand that everyone be treated with equal dignity. Skybridge Airlines continued to thrive. By the end of the second year after Abigail went public, the company was rated the #1 airline for customer satisfaction among black travelers and the #3 overall airline in North America. Other carriers had to either match Skybridge's standards or lose market share. The competitive pressure drove industry-wide improvements. Abigail appeared on the cover of Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. The feature article described her as the reluctant activist who turned personal pain into systemic change. She gave a TED Talk that was viewed 40 million times, speaking about how privilege and power could be used to lift others up rather than exclude them. She became a sought-after speaker at business schools and conferences, always emphasizing that representation mattered but was not enough, that real change required constant vigilance and willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. On Christmas Eve 2 years after the incident, Abigail flew home to Detroit to spend the holidays with her family. She booked the same flight number, 742, sitting in the same seat, 2A. It had become a personal tradition, a way of reclaiming that space and that moment. During boarding, she noticed an elderly white woman struggling with her carry-on bag. Abigail stood and helped her lift it into the overhead compartment. The woman thanked her warmly, then looked closer at Abigail's face. "You're her, aren't you? The airline owner. I saw you on the news." Abigail nodded, unsure what would come next. The woman reached out and took Abigail's hand in both of hers. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "My grandson is black. Adopted by my daughter when she couldn't have children of her own. He's 6 now, and I think about the world he's growing up in all the time. I think about whether people will judge him, whether doors will be closed to him. What you did, standing up like that, fighting for change even when it was hard, that gives me hope that maybe his world will be a little bit better than it was." The two women stood there in the aisle of the airplane, hands clasped, sharing a moment of connection across race and generation. It was everything Abigail had been fighting for, captured in one small interaction. As the plane took off, Abigail looked out the window at Atlanta's lights falling away below. She thought about Adelaide Whitmore, who had sent her an email 6 months ago. The email was long, rambling, clearly written and rewritten many times. Adelaide apologized, not with excuses but with genuine remorse. She described the therapy she had started, the books she had read, the volunteer work she now did at a community center in a predominantly black neighborhood. She did not ask for forgiveness or expect a response, just wanted Abigail to know that the incident had forced her to confront ugliness in herself that she had always denied existed. Abigail had not responded to the email immediately. She saved it, unsure what to think about whether people could truly change or whether Adelaide's transformation was performative. But eventually, she sent a brief reply acknowledging the email without absolving Adelaide of responsibility. "Change," she wrote, "is possible but it requires more than words. It requires sustained action over years, not months. Keep doing the work. Maybe someday your grandson will benefit from it." She thought about Aaron Matthews, who had reached out through mutual contacts asking if there was any path to redemption, any way he could work in aviation again. Abigail had been blunt. The path to redemption, she told him, was not about getting his old career back. It was about understanding the harm he had done and working to prevent others from causing similar harm. Several months later, she heard he had started volunteering with a nonprofit that helped formerly incarcerated people find jobs, many of them black men struggling with discrimination in hiring. It was not glamorous work, and it did not make him a hero, but it was something. Abraham Wilson never reached out. He had sued Skybridge for wrongful termination, claiming reverse discrimination. The lawsuit was dismissed, and Abraham faded from public view, bitter and convinced he was the real victim in the story. Some people, Abigail had learned, could not or would not change. Her phone buzzed with a text from her brother. "Landing soon. Mom made your favorite dinner and enough food for an army." Abigail smiled and typed back. 20 minutes. Can't wait. As the plane began its descent into Detroit, she reflected on how much had changed in 2 years. She had gone from being an anonymous owner to a public figure, from victim to advocate, from someone fighting for her own dignity to someone fighting for a more just system. The work was far from finished. Discrimination still existed, in aviation and everywhere else. But progress was possible, justice was possible, change was possible. It required courage to speak up, resources to fight back, and persistence to see it through. It required believing that the struggle mattered even when victory was uncertain. The plane touched down smoothly. Passengers applauded, a holiday tradition Abigail had always found charming. She gathered her bag and walked through the jet bridge into the terminal where her family waited, her mother's arms open wide, her father's proud smile, her brother's enthusiastic hug. They drove through snowy streets toward home, Christmas lights twinkling on houses they passed. The radio played carols and her mother hummed along. For this moment, in this space, everything felt right. But Abigail knew she would return to the fight after the holiday. There were more stories to tell, more policies to change, more minds to open, more barriers to break. The sky was vast and there was still so much work to do to make it equal for everyone who wanted to fly. Some people flew to escape. Abigail Thompson flew to transform the very sky itself. What would you do if you discovered discrimination happening in your workplace or business? Drop a comment with the number 1 if you believe standing up against injustice is worth the personal cost. Hit that like button if Abigail's story inspired you to think differently about how we treat each other. Subscribe to this channel because stories like these remind us that one person with courage can change entire systems. And share this video with someone who needs to hear that their voice matters, that their dignity is worth fighting for, that justice delayed is not justice denied if we refuse to give up. Thank you for watching this story about courage, consequence, and the ongoing fight for equality. As we celebrate this holiday season, may we all remember that the greatest gift we can give each other is respect, dignity, and the willingness to stand up when we see wrong being done. Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and may your new year be filled with the courage to make your corner of the world more just. This story teaches us that discrimination rarely announces itself with obvious hatred. Modern racism wears professional uniforms, speaks in polite tones, and hides behind policies and procedures. It operates through assumptions about who belongs in certain spaces, whose complaints deserve attention, and whose dignity matters less. The most important lesson is that silence enables injustice. Every person who witnessed Abigail's humiliation and said nothing became complicit in her mistreatment. Speaking up carries risks, but staying silent guarantees nothing changes. We also learn that power and privilege create responsibility. Abigail could have accepted a settlement, taken her money, and moved on. Instead, she used her position to expose systemic problems and create lasting change. Her story proves that individual courage can spark collective transformation. Another crucial insight is that good intentions without accountability are meaningless. Skybridge had diversity policies, but without oversight and consequences, those policies failed to prevent discrimination. Real change requires systems that make it harder to discriminate and impossible to ignore when it happens. Finally, we learn that redemption is possible but not guaranteed. Some people, when confronted with their prejudices, genuinely work to change. Others double down on denial. The difference lies in willingness to acknowledge harm, accept responsibility, and commit to sustained transformation rather than performative gestures. Has this story changed how you think about everyday discrimination? Comment below with your own experiences or observations about how racism shows up in professional settings. If you believe that accountability matters more than comfortable silence, smash that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel because we share true stories that challenge us to build a more just world, and you won't want to miss the next powerful narrative about ordinary people creating extraordinary change. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that speaking up against injustice is not optional, it's essential. Share it with young people who need to see examples of courage in action. Share it with anyone who has ever felt powerless in the face of discrimination and needs to know that change is possible when we refuse to accept wrong as normal. Thank you for spending time with Abigail's story today. As you go forward, remember that we all have choices about what kind of world we're building with our daily actions and our willingness to stand up when we witness injustice. May you have the courage to be the person who speaks up, the strength to use whatever privilege you hold to lift others, and the wisdom to recognize that dignity is not negotiable. Until next time, keep fighting the good fight.